Since the 1980s, the influx of tourists traveling to Barcelona has only increased. It has been unchecked and not really regulated because of the illusion of economic benefit. Over-tourism is something that is inherently harmful because it means that locals are pushed out of their own communities because of rapid gentrification. Supposed dollar signs that the opposition might tell you about clearly don't matter at the point at which individuals are marching in the streets of Santorini and Barcelona telling tourists to go home. Proud to propose. Three arguments coming from the propagation. The first is on why we benefit the economy, the second is on culture, and the third argument in the second speech is an argument around the environment. Before that, what's our stance? One, we aren't banning tourism, that's absurd. We're rather limiting the numbers in the industry. We believe that any industry can have economic benefit, but it is the duty of the state to regulate against unchecked growth in order to ensure that the possible harms don't outweigh the possible benefits. For clarity, we want tourism to not overshoot the carrying capacity that currently exists. What then does our model look like? 5 things. A, it looks like establishing quotas, particularly during peak season. So for example, limiting the number of individuals that can access something like a tourist visa. It looks like how Greece admins has put a cap to 20,000 individuals per day, down from historically where the number was 40,000. The significant reduction is going to be determined by states alongside relevant experts in the field. B, we're looking to impose restrictions on tourist-centered accommodation. So this looks like how Berlin has put a regulation on short-term rentals, requiring a permit to lease out only a portion of the apartment in residential areas at a time. C, we're looking to also support the implementation of additional premiums for specific areas. So this looks like how Venice has an increased €5 fine for visiting Venice on day trips if individuals aren't living there. D, we're also willing to support all other reasonable initiatives to limit the number of tourists within these major destinations and also prevent the inflation impact that currently exists. Lastly, this cap would be determined on a country-to-country basis, but it would be a cap determined on the basis of reducing the country's dependency on tourism. That's what the most important thing in this debate is. Second part of the strategy. We're willing to trade off the constant influx of money for tourism because of 3 reasons. 1, government's responsibility supports local populations first and foremost because of social contracts. Hyper-tourism uniquely has a blanket harm to individuals, and in most instances, the money from tourism doesn't actually go to locals. I'm going to prove this a little bit later. But 2, tourists are still able to visit on our side, not completely foregoing the economic benefit that exists, which is maintaining a long-term sustainability. Third, access to tourism creates a dependency that forces governments to have pervasive interests. So the idea that the government of Brazil is now likely to not have an incentive to face favelas because they have a reliance on slum tourism is something that they can never trade off on their side. Argument then as to how we benefit the economy. Before I prove this argument, I'll take a few Argument then as to why we benefit the economy. The framing here is very simple. Unchecked tourism has led to harms for the domestic economy because oftentimes there is a prioritization around the needs and comforts of wealthy tourists over the population. Why then do we have the economy? First, the allure of tourism is so great that politicians often don't take the necessary means to regulating it until there's a critical tipping point. So private interest overshadows the domestic population's well-being. Airbnb across the world has led to increased demand for short-term rentals, increasing the general cost of living in city centers, which leads to a real human cost, at the point at which pensioners and local individuals can't outcompete with tourists in terms of like on a money basis. That means that it's likely to harm those individuals and increase the prices of things in that area. The minimum wage in Spain is a little over €1,000 a week, but on average, tourists in Madrid spend about 1,000 euros. This leads to them being outpaced and there being an inflation impact out of all of this. Second, there's a seasonality around the world. So tourism centers are on peak seasons where markets pop up and there's accommodation that's pretty booked up. The seasonality is harmful because when tourism is allowed to grow unchecked, you create a dependency on that tourism. That means then that out of season, there's no real economic benefit. This is especially important because even in the best case when they do provide jobs, those jobs just aren't stable, particularly pernicious in the instances when governments incentivize mass training, because those are the types of things like hospitality training that are short-term in nature and they're very volatile. Third, the massive gains from tourism on their side just leak out of the country because MNCs are the largest corporations that have the ability to create large resorts and tourist destinations. 70% of all of the money tourists spend in Thailand ends up leaving that country because international airlines don't benefit the local economy. Local vendors often get bought out by MNCs looking to gentrify. The reason as to why MNCs and leakage are inherent to scale and are inherent to mass tourism is because they enable MNCs to get more economies of scale, to keep prices low, and fundamentally there's a greater likelihood of that happening on their side. But even if leakage exists on either side, it is far worse on their side, because more and more people come into these local communities, making those economic issues far worse, especially important if one is going to make any argument about developing world economies, the reverse for the being that they're likely to be talking about. On our side, however, destinations in particular don't get overwhelmed. There's less inflation pressure on the poor and the middle class, comparatively. One, locals are always going to outnumber tourists, but they need to be able to live in city centres where they can have economic activity to help the broader economy grow. Two, on our side, states can invest into more long-term, durable economic opportunities because when tourism decreases, it's likely other industries can grow because there's more utility that's provided. Even if gentrification occurs on our side, it is still likely comparatively better because that gentrification is going to happen organically and not to the needs of wealthy tourists. So you don't have MNCs pushing for rapid development and things like high-rise buildings. It's going to happen catering to locals. On their side, eventually the appeal and novelty is going to wear off, and that country is going to be left with no other means of supplementing that value. Tourists are going to move on and the trend is going to be over, like we've seen in the Spanish islands. So that means then that you don't have capacity for the country to build again. The impact of this argument is twofold. Firstly, we've seen this harm exist in wealthy countries, and we think now regulation is especially important and paramount for developing nations that are looking to become tourist hotspots. Cape Town, a city in South Africa, has the most Airbnbs in the world because of pro-business governments allowing MNCs to buy up and construct new tourist accommodations, leading to mass displacements. Tourists just don't care because they don't have an attachment to their country, and even when they are aware of this, they prioritize their own comforts over the comforts of others. But secondly, there is a real human cost to all of the things we're talking about. It is the mother who is laid off from her resort because that resort isn't making money. It is the young couple that cannot afford to start a family and build a home because homes are too expensive because of gentrification. That is the type of world that exists on the opposition. Second argument then around culture, before I do this short.
For nations like Seychelles, they have to do tourists because no alternate economy has worked. What alternate economy would they comparatively shift to in your world?
We gave you two structural reasons as to why these economies are likely to diversify and they're likely to have other industries grow. You need to actually engage with those. Argument we improve cultural preservation and social cohesion, especially in the developing world, because there's an increase in demand for tourism there. It's taking the characteristic, however, of being exploitative in nature as opposed to being appreciative of that culture. There's a disrespect for culturally and spiritually significant areas. So, for example, in Peru, they had to limit the tourist numbers that exist in order to better ensure that those harms don't exist to monuments. In Greece, they had to literally arrest individuals because they're defacing things like the Colosseum and historically significant architecture. These are not isolated instances, panel, but they're structurally true because tourists just don't have the same appreciation and they just don't have the same attachment. They're individuals who want to look cool and get an Instagram post off. Currently, all across Europe, major tourist hubs are seeing an increased protest from individuals because individuals don't like these things. Spanish individuals are spitting in tourist streams and telling them to leave their country. This is because institutions are set up to cater for tourist individuals, not necessarily locals of their country. So complaints about drunk or disruptive or loud tourists just don't matter to the institutions. We solve these issues because comparatively, on our side, we have smaller numbers of tourists. That means then it's easier to regulate those individuals as opposed to their side. This argument is especially important because if we better maintain the cultural conditions, it's likely individuals who do actually care about those things are going to visit that country. So we maintain tourism over a longer period of time. If they're going to argue about tourism and whether it's valuable, then our case is simply prior to theirs. Good proposition, because we make tourism work for locals again. Not international businesses, not MNCs, but the locals who are left to deal with high prices, louder areas, and their homes and harm.
Significant restriction on tourism is a significant restriction on the economy. We will forward two arguments from Japan in this debate. First argument on why we better the economy, and our second argument will be brought by our second speaker. Before argumentation, 3 pieces of setup. And note that this will take down the majority of their argumentation. Firstly, what is our stance in this debate? We are willing to take a hard stance. We support substantial increases in tourism, and we encourage more and more tourists to come in. Secondly, what is the characterization of these tourist cities? Major tourist destinations often feature distinct tourist zones, bustling with hotels, attractions, and shops catering to visitors, while local population areas are more residential and cater to the daily needs and lifestyles of the locals. This separation ensures that tourism infrastructure is concentrated, preserving local culture and community life in separate, less commercialized neighborhoods. Third, what alternative policies are we willing to support? Because we agree that to some extent, regulation is necessary. We think that cities should basically do whatever is necessary for their nation, but there are a few examples, such as 1, spreading tourist traffic. Promoting visits during off-peak seasons can help distribute the influx of tourists more evenly, reducing the strain on popular destinations. 2, improving infrastructure and facilities. For example, Barcelona's expansion of its metro system has been instrumental in managing tourist traffic more efficiently, spreading visitors across the city. 3, severe punishments for destructive behavior by tourists. Therefore, the problems that they talked about can be fixed without significant limitations on the number of tourists. On this piece on frame though, I want to make two additional and important notes. First, this regulation is exclusive to our world because the tax revenue we get from tourism, which is necessary to implement these regulations, can only be gathered in our world. This means proposition cannot co-opt these alternative regulations. Second, proposition cannot say these alternatives do not exist in our world because we just have to support the status quo. And in the status quo, Vienna already has rent control, Barcelona already bans Airbnb. Therefore, the proposition's burden in this debate is to change the status quo. These milder policies are our side of this debate. And before I move on to our first argument, I'll take a few lines.
Speaker, if it is that you're investing so much into having to maintain tourism, why don't you have any spillover effects to other parts of the economy?
We think that it is very unlikely. Our speakers will extend upon that, but we think that the crucial reason why the economy won't diversify is because those places are not attractive, right? That's the crucial reason why currently these places are not popular. We'll prove to you this further in our case. Okay, the first argument on the economic development. And note that this argumentation will directly clash with their argument. The thesis of this argument is that tourism boosts the economy and creates jobs. There are two layers to this argument. Firstly, how does tourism stimulate the economy? There are 4 notes on how much money tourists spend, which proves the stimulation that tourists bring. 1. Tourists uniquely want to spend money. This is because tourists inherently have a strong inclination to spend money during their travels, times of excitement and relaxation, where they are prepared to indulge in various activities and experiences. 2. Tourists often come from countries with stronger currencies, meaning that their money has a greater purchasing power in destinations with weaker currencies. This difference enables them to afford more luxuries and experiences than they could at home, which leads to increased spending during their travels. 3. Traveling itself is inherently expensive. When tourists visit another country, their expenditures extend far beyond just airfare and accommodation and extend to public transportation, dining, souvenirs, entertainment, and various services such as guided tours or taxis. Each of these expenditures contributes to substantial influx of money into the local economy. But fourth, and lastly, it creates spending on unique services. For instance, locals have homes and sublets, so they don't use hotels as much. Locals cook home food, so they don't regularly go to restaurants. Locals barely use taxis, as they have cars and public transport. Locals don't consume souvenirs. Therefore, the implication is that the types of spending that tourists do is extremely unique and valuable. And before I move on to the second layer, I'll take a quick line.
Speaker, you literally just said that individuals can use public transport, and then you say that they can use cars. Which one is it? Because they both contradict.
We don't think it's contradictory, and it's very unclear what the implication of that, even if there is a contradiction. Okay. Second layer of this argument then, how the proposition's comparative harms the economy. There are six main impacts. 1. Job loss. Intuitively speaking, this economic failure will lead to massive job loss for people in the service sector and tourism sectors, unlike they claim. These are jobs that are very accessible to low-skilled workers. These are workers with very few transferable skills, no education, and no experience, which means it's incredibly hard to find a new industry to house all of these unemployed workers. Furthermore, when an entire city is suddenly unemployed, it also means more crime happens. It means there are no longer support networks for the unemployed. Job loss has a massive impact here. 2. Promotion of service work. The types of jobs created by the tourism industry are often more favorable compared to alternatives in many developing countries. While manufacturing jobs, which many developing economies rely on, oftentimes involve strenuous and physically demanding labor. Positions in the tourism sector, such as hotel staff, tour guides, and other service roles, are far less physically taxing. These service sector jobs are much more desirable because these positions offer a better work environment and greater job satisfaction. 3. Loss in government resources. The immediate effect is a substantial loss in tax revenue, which typically comes from both tourism-related jobs and the expenditures of tourists themselves. Governments also oftentimes have to take a lot of debt to cover welfare expenses for the unemployed and incur additional debt to sustain essential services and economic stability. For many nations, tourism constitutes a considerable segment of their economy. Thus, replacing this lost economic activity is a task that leads to prolonged periods of financial instability and economic decline. But fourthly, there will be less foreign direct investment, or FDI, meaning less corporations come in. Firstly, the immediate short-term losses from a curtailed tourism sector make it less profitable and riskier for investors to allocate capital to the affected country due to the anticipated return on investment diminishing as the tourism industry revenue stream dries up. Secondly, the signaling effect of such a drastic policy shift creates broader concerns about the country's investment climate. By effectively declaring war on its largest industry after years and years of promotion and support, the government signals unpredictability and potential hostility towards other sectors. This erodes investor confidence as they fear that similar abrupt and detrimental policy changes might impact their ventures in other industries, ultimately leading to a reduction in FDI. Fifth, losing foreign currency. Tourists bring in foreign currency that supports the local economy and exchange rate. Therefore, without this, the country faces a deficit, weakening its currency. A weaker currency makes imports more expensive, causing inflation and reducing purchasing power. This can lead to a cycle of declining investor confidence and further economic problems, causing this vicious cycle. The sixth, and finally, it also leads to bankruptcy. Tourism businesses often invest heavily in real estate, infrastructure, and services, expecting steady revenue. Therefore, when tourism stops, they can go bankrupt, leading to job losses and long-term debt struggles. These bankruptcies affect banks, causing significant losses and tighter credit, which slows economic growth. Therefore, the implication of all of these 6 mechanisms is simple. This economy is massively harmed when tourism is significantly limited. Significant restriction on tourism is significant restriction on the economy. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
The COVID-19 pandemic plunged the economies of a lot of tourist destinations around the world into essential disrepair. That looks like economies like Thailand, who lost 30% of local GDP when it came to the decrease in flooding in some tourist areas. This is because an extension of tourist economies creates a dependency on something that's inherently short-termist and inherently unequal. It's something that can never be depended on, but you create the direct incentive for states to do so at the expense of their local populations. On South Africa, we believe that areas ought to benefit the individuals that live in them. Never been prouder to propose 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on context and strategy, I'm asking the question, where are these areas? Secondly, on the policy limitations when it comes to limiting the amount of tourists, and lastly then, on the economic benefits that we bring through our policy. Contextually speaking then, let's talk about the development of over-tourism and how it's something that came about. What we told you was that when the 1970s allowed for mass long-haul flights to become something that is commercially viable, it also created an incentive for states not to consider the capacity of their regulation. That means they jumped straight into the inviting of tourists into their nations. There was way more demand than there actually was supply. But because they didn't consider these things initially, we now have the problems on our side that haven't been addressed. But secondly, we told you that this was concentrated in developed nations for 3 main reasons. Firstly, because of cultural compatibility. That means that British tourists would rather go to Ibiza, for instance, on holiday than a country in Africa or Asia, because they believe they're going to be more integrated into that culture when they go. But secondly, on availability. That's to say that the lines, the planes, the flights available going to those regions were things that were more easily accessible, and tourists then channeled to those areas. But lastly, on safety and stability. Afghanistan is a great country when it comes to views, a great country when it comes to history and culture, but it's something that people are unlikely to visit because they don't think they're going to be welcomed in a safety and political stability sense. What does this analysis then do? It frames out the majority of their instances when they talk about nations in the developing world that are going to be harmed by this policy. Because the 5 biggest nations when it comes to tourists are New York, or the cities when it comes to tourists are New York, London, LA, Paris, and New York City. And these are things we think that are directly able to benefit from other mechanisms other than tourism, which means all the direct harms that are created on the individuals in those states are things that need to be prioritized. But the second thing strategically is the idea of inherency. The fact that they provide generalized benefits of tourism without showing why over-tourism that we see under status quo is something that necessarily has to be maintained. Firstly then on the policy and the ability to limit tourists on their side. We give you 3 responses to their analysis. The first thing is that all regions of the city have the biggest tourist destinations. What you're doing is competing for centrality. That's nightlife, that's access to to amenities. That's the things that individuals and tourists are directly in opposition for, because they want to experience those amenities and the centrality of the city, which means it's a direct competition that they can't engage with on their side. But secondly, note the inherent difficulty on policing large crowds and the disincentive there is to do so, because tourists are going to like your area less when they feel like it's a police state, when they feel like they're being actively cracked down on, which means unless you have small crowds that you can regulate using smaller security services, you aren't able to regulate the larger crowds on their side because it detracts from that ambiance. But secondly, lastly, on the behavior of individuals, we note firstly that tourism creates an environment where people feel like social norms are suspended. We're in a place to have fun, we're going to do that at all costs. But secondly, on the capacity to spend, they talked about currency disparities. That's directly worsened on their side because people are able to absorb larger fines and are psychologically inclined to do so because they come in with the intention of spending money. That then frames a direct incentive to pivot away from over-tourism that exists under status quo, but also shows you why our mechanism is uniquely beneficial in that regard. The second conversation is the idea of economic benefits and the capacity to diversify. Here, we just think they don't engage with what exists under status quo, where tourism creates a direct incentive to lock yourself into particular markets. And here is where we talk about the fact that tourism is effectively seen by governments as a free source of money. It's like something that's based on the natural features and requires minimal investment when it comes to the development of regions. Note then that policies that rely on developing areas within your nations are disbeneficial to states in two regards. Firstly, they require more active investment because of that development, but secondly, there's a sacrifice that needs to be done. So if you have to run, for instance, protectionist measures to protect a nascent industry, that's something that's going to cost you trade deals. That's something that requires political inertia in order to happen. That then creates an incentive or a structure where states are able to lean on tourism over more because it doesn't require political sacrifices in order to get off the ground. This looks like nations like Thailand that have nascent manufacturing industries that they disregard because of the incentives that tourism creates. Also note, tourism creates two harmful incentives. One, it creates the incentive to just look away from social problems. That's Airbnb cutting deals with the city of Cape Town. But secondly, it creates incentive to actually entrench these social issues. So Thailand is notorious for sex tourism. That's something that Western people go to experience, and it's something that the government won't regulate because of that economic benefit. But note then, they also didn't engage with the litany of harms that we brought you when it came to disparities in purchasing power. And they agreed to these harms. They told you tourists come in to spend. And what that means is the generalized increase in standard of living, in property taxes for the demand of short-term tourist accommodation, all of these things then are impacted on their side. How do we weigh out then? We weigh out because they create a diffuse harm and we create a concentrated benefit. A diffuse harm with a concentrated benefit. So they're able to benefit the few people that are employed in these areas, in these cities, while generalizing and decreasing the standard of living. That's through the clashes between tourists and individuals, the loud cities. That's through the increase in standard of living, which means individuals aren't able to benefit. Comparatively, we get a large-scale benefit for everyone who exists in the city on a marginal cost. Before I move on to my argument then, sure, I'll take a point.
When you limit the context of this debate to developed nations, it is factually true that countries like America or Britain are not entirely dependent upon tourism for their economy. How can you say that diversification is necessary for developed nations?
Okay, so I just gave you two different contexts that you need to engage with. On one side, you have developed economies, which creates an increase in the cost of living within these nations and pushes people to the outskirts of cities like LA. That's something that's directly disbeneficial, and that's something that can be fixed easily because we have the GDP reserves to just not rely on tourism. In developing nations, you create the direct incentive to lean on tourism as a mechanism, and you allow for regulation not to take place. Those are two different harms that you create, and you need to engage with them respectively. On the idea then that you create harms to the environment, the framing here is that we have an increase in environmental tourism under status quo. These are regions that carry appeal because of their aesthetics. These are regions that are also uniquely fragile because ecosystems are dependent on balance. Note how this is harmed in three ways on their side. The first way is the increased demand for accommodation and luxury. This means the construction of tourist regions. What that means is tourism expands in popularity, and companies work on increasingly more extravagant and resource-intensive projects in an attempt to corner the markets. This looks like the Palm Islands in Dubai that required a massive amount of sand to be pulled in order to build them and destroyed reef infrastructure in the process. That means that those ecosystems are irreparably damaged and can't be maintained. But secondly, note that tourist presence creates pollution and an environment environmental harm. That's firstly in terms of resource use. So there's massive resource-intensive hotels that are going to divert like resources away from locals. Dubai literally couldn't fight its wildfires because it didn't have the water. That water was being diverted to the hotels in the region. But secondly, on waste products. Note that tourism are uniquely dependent on single-use plastics because they aren't embedded in the region for a long time. You're eating out more, you're going to create more waste products in that regard. Based on all of that then, they fail to benefit the individuals who live within particular nations, and we get that benefit. It's never been prouder to propose.
I want to firstly deal with their economy. They give you three main mechanisms in their first argument. I'm going to deal with each one. But before dealing with each one, I think it's imperative to note that they don't prove to you a comparative in this debate. They have two burdens to fulfill in their comparative that go unfulfilled at this point in this debate. Firstly, they still have to prove to you that alternatives to some extent do exist. That the asserted POI response that, oh, alternatives probably do exist, cannot prove to you that that is true. In the Maldives, the reason why the nation is reliant upon tourism is because no other industry adequately can replace the economic impact that that has. In Seychelles, the reason why the economy is 40% dependent on tourism is because nothing can replace that GDP impact. Therefore, they still have to prove to you alternatives do exist. But secondly, they then have to prove to you that these alternatives are in any way better because their harms are not in any way unique to tourism. Look at, for example, their claim about diversification or higher cost of living. That claim is basically going to be symmetric in every other alternative you can bring. Let's say you shift to manufacturing. Let's say you have car companies come in and build infrastructure in your country and hire people in your country. These car companies are going to bring in hundreds of foreign workers with them who are similarly going to push the economy into overdrive and are similarly going to increase the cost of living. The problem is not unique to tourism. But I also want to look at each of their mechanizations. Their first mechanization is on cost of living. I have two levels of response against this at the top. One, that we framed from our second piece on frame that is unengaged by their speaker to say that, well, oftentimes the tourist areas are very far apart, or at the very least in different areas from people where locals live. And governments do have incentive to structure economies, structure societies this way, which is why in Amsterdam there's a tourist district and then there's a locality district where the cost of living is a lot lower. But secondly, I don't believe that the cost of living going up is just unique to the cost of living going up, but rather things like salaries and infrastructure go up with it, which means we can match the pace of inflation with the salaries. But finally, I want to weigh our first argument, our argumentation on things like vulnerable jobs and the general economy as a whole above this cost of living claim in four crucial ways. Number one, that having a job, being employed, is the prerequisite for you even caring about cost of living. If you have no income, the damage of cost of living is highest for you. Secondly, that high cost of living has some amount of solvency. You are helpless in getting an income out of scratch as an unemployed individual, but there are many ways to do things like cut expenses or just move to another area. Thirdly, high cost of living largely only applies to more rich individuals. The price increases in this debate impacts luxury goods and not everyday goods. It's restaurants, not grocery stores that are impacted. It's hotels in the city structure, not rent in the outskirts. It's the cost of living that disproportionately only impacts tourists or those who are rich. The unemployment disproportionately impacts the poor. That is the impact you all care about. But fourthly, that the state has some amount of more moral obligation to these individuals than they do to them. Because the state is actively at fault for the reliance of these workers that they have on the tourist industry. Not only did they allow for it, but they did not create good alternatives, and for years actively encouraged tourism and tourist jobs. And now they're stabbing them in the back. The state has a moral obligation to these vulnerable individuals. That is why cost of living is unimportant in this debate. Secondly, let's talk about their seasonality claim. Two responses. Number one, this is structurally untrue. The off-season vacationing is incredibly common. It's cheaper, it's less crowded. A lot of people do that. But on the flip, furthermore, we're willing to strongly encourage such policy where we encourage off-season touristing. From our frame, we tell you this is a viable alternative. The second response I want to make is that the seasonality claim is highly uncomparative because at worst, we have a season of prosperity and a season of stagnation. In their world, they have constant stagnation. Their third claim is that these massive gains leak out through multinational corporations. We've provided to you various mechanizations from our argument. We actually have 6 of them, none of which are heavily reliant upon MNCs being willing to trickle down the economy. For example, our second mechanism, our second impact was on the shift to service industries. This means that even if these corporations suck up all of the money, the fact that the economy shifts in that direction in and of itself is a benefit, and in that way trickle down still does happen. Let's talk about our argumentation. Our argumentation gave you 6 reasons, 6 impacts why this economic benefit tourism brings is uniquely and massively important. The proposition fails to heavily engage to any of these mechanizations. I think that this alone is debate winning, but especially on vulnerable jobs, I think that wins us this debate. Let's talk about culture then. The claim on culture is basically tourist disrespect culture. I have 2 layers of engagement to this. Number 1, that cultural importance for locals or indigenous people can still be protected in our world. We can literally do things like just subsidize these areas. For example, the US natural reserves do give communal ownership to indigenous peoples to allow them access to that. But secondly, that touristy cultural sites and important cultural sites are oftentimes massively different. For example, in India, people are obsessed with beautiful mosques, but the actual mosques that are regularly visited are ones that are further away, far less used, and far less touristy. The second level of response is to say, well, all of this dur and disrespect for cultural sites can heavily be mitigated by forms of regulation. And this is not just policing coming in. This is also, for example, people who are visiting the site alongside you, telling you should actually take off your shoes when you walk into a Japanese temple. Now, proposition gives you various reasons why this is probably untrue. They say things like competition or how you cannot police this or individual behavior. There's 2 levels of engagement here. Firstly, on the level of incentive, I think states have massive incentive to do this. Yeah, sure, being seen as a police state is probably not that much of a good thing, but being seen as a dysfunctional state is far worse of a harm. Also, you have some amount of incentive to cater to your voters who hold you accountable, which means you do have to care about your citizen population. But second level of response, on the level of capacity, it's actually fairly easy to regulate this. Just fine people more, or just get more people, just get more police, or in the case of slum tourism, just ban things like gambling. I don't think it's that hard. I think we've proven capacity. 2. Finally, on the environment, they say 2 things. We have 3 responses. Number 1, that the delta is massively small. That at best they just limit tourism. Some harm still do accrue. Secondly, we can regulate this. Please use paper rather than plastic. Those are policies that are being implemented in the status quo, and states have massive incentive to do so. And thirdly, I don't think this impact is as important or as proximate as the varying other economic impacts we've given you. These are unique impacts that are only manifesting under tourism. I think that this takes this debate. I want to run an extending argument in my last minute then on liberalization. There are 3 reasons why liberalization happens when tourism is massive. Number 1, a large influx of tourists puts a big and immediate pressure to relax certain policies that are oppressive and conservative, because when governments continue to get massive revenue from the tourist industry, they have to maintain this positive image and avoid international backlash. Look at Qatar. Secondly, active tourism necessitates easing of restrictive laws and implementation of consistent policies as authorities face challenges in selectively enforcing regulations on tourists. Initially, authorities may try to say, well, tourists, you don't have to follow these laws, but at some point, the influx of tourists is going to be too much. Governments will have to make liberal blanket policies. Thirdly, on normalization, when tourists openly engage in behaviors that are restricted or stigmatized, such as same-sex relationships or liberal dress codes, it gradually normalizes these behaviors, and all of this leads to softened local prejudices and inclusive policies. This looks like, for example, Saudi Arabia's introduction of tourist visas being accompanied by social reforms like women being allowed to travel without male guardians. This looks like Bangkok, which is a renowned destination for LGBTQ tourists, where it could have never have evolved in this way if it weren't for tourism. This is important not only because it benefits the larger society in forms of freedoms, but also for the most vulnerable minorities, LGBTQ individuals, women who suffer in conservative societies. Liberalization is massively important for the tourists, for the economy, for the vulnerable individuals. Oppose.
The burden of the opposition was quite hard. They couldn't depend upon the already existing benefits of tourism as they are right now. What they needed to justify was why over-tourism was likely A, going to continue those benefits in a way that is sustainable, but B, wouldn't have any adverse effects in the instances in which they do fail. Given the fact that we've had 2 speeches from the opposition side that haven't provided a justification for any of these things, it's quite clear that your ballot goes to Team South Africa. 2 questions that I'm going to be asking with interactions. The first is on economic benefit. The second is on cultural harm. But before that, though, I just want to deal with a couple of things in terms of context and strategy. Firstly, on the context between developing nations versus developed nations. Let's assume that this case takes place in the world of the opposition, where we specifically look at developing nations. Why exactly do we think that this is bad? We think that the increased dependence on tourism harms them in terms of the shocks that they're likely going to be facing on their side. Two reasons why that's the case. The first is because the fact that the majority of the benefit that they get on their side is likely going to be seasonal. That is to say that you only get a minimal income in the season in which tourism is most likely going to be effective. In the cases in which they want to derive the off-season benefit, we don't think that a majority of people visit the majority of these countries in off-seasons, mainly because of the fact that the conditions that allow them to go there aren't necessarily there. So they cannot enjoy natural beauty because of extreme weather. They cannot enjoy the things that they already claim are going to be true in that regard. But second, in the case of natural disasters, things like COVID and all of those things, they have to accept the fact that the majority of the economy under their world is likely going to be stopping. This means that a majority of the income that you would have been having in that regard is going to be taken away. But furthermore, that means more economic adversity for these countries. The Seychelles and the Maldives suffered during COVID, mainly because of the fact that their main source of income wasn't protected. That means on their side, they're most likely going to be having far worse incentives and far worse impacts for these countries in the first place. On the comparative, why exactly are we better? On our side, we can have multiple avenues of growth that we can utilize for economic stability. Things like retail stores and things like having to train individuals in order to ensure economic growth. Second question then, on the strategy of this draft. Firstly, like they say to us that there is going to be some level of regulation. But here's the thing, they need to prove a whole lot more in order to ensure that this is going to be true. Because let's just dissect the logic. If they say that tourists have so much money that they're willing to be spending on these very same countries, they're most likely going to be spending it on that regulation, and they're still going to be getting away with majority of the problems that exist within those countries. So if it is that they're littering, they're going to be paying those fines what then? They don't actually provide a mechanism towards which they can actually regulate majority of these problems that exist within their world in the first place. First clash then, on the economy. Here I want to deal with the three key points that they give us. They firstly tell us that tourists spend a lot of money and that benefits the majority of these countries. Secondly, they tell us on their side that on our side we're going to have a lot of job losses. But lastly, that they tell us that you can have government resources and diminishing in their on our side. Cool. First point then, on the idea that tourists spend much more money on their side. Two reasons why this is bad. First, because foreign currency tends to harm the locals and their ability to actually participate in the economy. That is to say that the nature of foreign currency is often inflammatory in nature. That is to say that they inflate prices and increase and decrease competition. That is to say that there is a higher bargaining power that is given specifically to tourists that is taken away from locals. So that's to say that an Airbnb for a tourist might have been a home for a local, and that means that they don't actually get that benefit under their rule. But second, a majority of tourists don't invest specifically into public transport and public services as they claim. This is because of the fact that in tourism you've had multiple alternatives that have been given in order to ensure profit. That's why Airbnbs have been available as opposed to hotels specifically. This means that on their side, they don't actually get that benefit going specifically to the government, but rather to companies that exist in order to exacerbate tourism under their world. That kind of incentive quite literally takes away the economic benefit they might have been getting in the first place. The second thing that they tell us is that we're most likely going to have a lot of job loss on our. Why exactly do we still have the capacity to have jobs on our side? There are two distinct reasons, and this also deals with the capacity to have alternative avenues of income. One, because there is a large scale of natural resources that can exist and can be utilized for specific benefits. So for example, the Seychelles invested into fisheries when they realized that tourism wasn't working out for them. That meant that you can unlock a labor capacity that doesn't actually provide or doesn't actually depend on tourism in the first place. Second, on our side, you have a massive labor pool that can be unlocked through vocational training. This is important because almost every developing nation has prioritized this because of the fact that they realize that this massive labor pool is something that is likely going to be much more effective under our law. No, thank you. Second, I'm going to ask the question on why exactly they themselves don't have jobs. One, because of the fact that diminishing returns decrease the capacity for you to have a job in the first place. That is to say that companies, specifically tourist agencies, tend to outsource jobs to alternative means and to alternative individuals apart from locals. This is because of the fact that they have the opportunity to cut costs, but furthermore, they have the opportunity to exploit individuals under their world. But second, there's a whole lot more competition under their world. That is to say that the tourism sector, if it is that they claim, is such low skill, that means that you're most probably going to have a lot of individuals competing for those very same industries. 60 million people live in South Africa Africa, yet only 5,000 of them are employed by Airbnb. That very same gap leads to more people being unemployed under their world. They have to deal with this problem specifically. Last question on the idea of the loss of government resources. They tell us here that you're going to be losing FDI, but you're also going to be losing tourism. What? A majority of the benefits from tourism go specifically to major MNCs. That is to say that you have the over-centralization of these industries, specifically in capital cities. So cities like Hanoi, quite literally had about 50 McDonald's and 50 Starbucks in every single corner that you turn. So majority of the benefits don't go to local industries, but rather go to huge MNCs that exist under their wall. But second, FDI comes specifically through things like trade of resources. You get that when you look at various other industries as opposed to tourism, who already gave you the fact that you have a large number of resources that exist under our world that can be unlocked. So that very same benefit isn't exclusive to their world. Before I move into the second class then, sure, I'll take
Things like vocational training can only be done with substantial amounts of money. That money is uniquely available when we have a tourist industry to fund vocational training.
Here's the thing. One, we already have some levels of infrastructure like universities that exist within developing nations and developed nations that can provide that training in the first place. But secondly, once you prioritize other industries, they're likely going to be growing to the extent where you can have that vocational training and to exponentially grow in either case, the same way tourism grew in the past few years. Second class then on cultural preservation. 2 points that they give us. The first is that you can relax certain laws under their world to create a sense of normality. One, majority of these countries literally used tourism as a front for their own abuses. Qatar literally used slavery as a means to hosting the FIFA World Cup in 2022. They cannot claim that this is a benefit that is normal, mainly because of the fact that this is something that allows for these governments to continue exploiting individuals. Post the FIFA World Cup, Qatar remained the same, similar with Russia in 2018. But second, if these governments are so oppressive, they can survive without those tourists in the first place. They don't provide a unique mechanism as to why exactly tourism means that these countries automatically change majority of the incentives. If they're oppressive, they don't care about alternative actors. That's why sanctions in majority cases didn't work in those countries. By the end of this debate, 2 things are true. The first is that over-tourism and the benefits of over-tourism are things that they haven't proven under their world specifically. But secondly, there are alternatives to over-tourism that have worked previously and can work now for purpose.
The best timing we know when a team loses a debate is when they decided to drop an entire argument when we gave you from second and when we explained to you that this is the most important. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to bring back our third argument or second argument that we gave you from Seiji about liberalization, which they themselves dropped at this point in time. We tell you that the LGBTQ couples being able to get accepted in the public or the increase in solo female travelers prompted in India as a result of this kind of like tourism and over-tourism and the pressure towards the government uniquely exists in our side of the house because liberalization is only going to happen when the government is pressured by the international people that have liberal values. Why is this likely to be a tipping point? Obviously this is because they do need to bite the bullet on their side of the house and say that defend any significant limitation and say that the substantial decrease in the number of visitors will exist. Which means that this substantial number of people pressuring the government to act is incredibly important because there's also a higher countervailing incentive to want to keep these kind of traditional ideas. Older generations would always want to justify that homosexuality is a sin. People would always want to say that marriage should only be decided by men. That is why when 40 million people actually swerve into the government, only when the government is dependent on the tourism industry, only when the government needs the tourism industry to actually gain those kind of things to begin with, that is at the point at which liberalization will actually going to happen, which is why at this point in time they're losing already. The weighing of this argument is really simple because the severity of the harm of this argument is extreme. Because note, things like environmental degradation and things like, let's say, economy, I think, for example, environment presumably exists to an extent on either side of the house when we talk about degradation. But when it comes to things like LGBTQ individuals not being able to accept it in public, that is something that actually comes at a cost of their existence, which is why I think this is one of the most important arguments within the debate. Now, let's talk about the clarification of this. Firstly, I want to look at the strategy of the proposition team in this debate. Because what they're saying is that, tourism sucks in the abstract. But for the most tourism-reliant countries, like Seychelles or Maldives, like Maldives, for example, I think this industry did play an important role to begin with. And I think their side of the house saying like how these MNCs are exploitative to begin with does not distract from the fact that Maldives, like 80% of the countries, are in fact dependent on the economy of the tourism industry, and that they need those industries for them to operate to begin with. Secondly, let's talk about the context of this debate. They say that the tourism in this debate most likely takes place in developed countries. They give you 3 structural reasons for this. Firstly, this is not true, especially empirically. Island of Seychelles, Macau, Jamaica, all intuitively does have a tourism industry. Second of all, the structural reason why our claim is more true is that they don't those kind of tourism industry oftentimes don't require industrialization to begin with. Those things like historical monuments or things like the nature that you have that actually appeal against the tourism in like tourists to begin with, those things are like things that are uniquely have without the industrialization to begin with, which is why I think developing countries are going to be the context of this debate as well. Their attempt to outframe their developing country and say that developed countries is the context of this debate is also terribly unstrategic for them insofar as diversification and things like that already exist in the United States of America. But even if the context of developed countries is more likely, our claim stands true, and we are willing to weigh this argument over theirs insofar as this is the most likely delta in the debate, insofar as Maldives and those countries are inherently reliant on those tourism industry. Therefore, the biggest burden that they needed to prove in this debate is why these vulnerable nations have the capacity to transition into a diversified economy. But here's when it gets very damaging for them, because they prove in the absence of the tourism industry, that other industry will arise, but they do not prove why the diversification is likely to happen. This is important because a lot of the developing countries have other industries, but those industries are monocultural economy. This looks like, let's say, you having resources, you having another manufacturing labor, which has meant that their claim cannot be one on diversification because they never prove why, in the absence of tourism, diversification will magically happen overnight, which is why their claim is gone. The third clarification I want to make is that they never prove why our model is going to be effective, and their model is the only way to solve all the problems. Because in Italy, for instance, fine and incarceration is able to prevent individuals from accessing to things like vandalization. And they say this is not perfect, but I think their model is also not perfect when they say things like disrespect culture. It's unclear to me why 40 million people becoming 10 million people is going to actually solve these problems to begin with. Before I move on to the passage, I'll take a POI.
Places like the Seychelles and Maldives are under threat due to climate change. What solution would you provide when the tourism industry is under threat currently?
So we cannot magically solve the problem. The point is, in the comparative, in the absence of tourism, countries like Maldives, countries like Seychelles are going to suffer the most. First clash on job losses. This stands both in the context of developing countries and developed countries. The first thing they see is that we need to actually do things like vocational training. Obviously, yes, but this can only be done on our side of the house when we can actually have a substantial income and actually have a substantial influx of money. When we tell you 3 mechanisms as to why those countries and those tourists are likely to spend money when the foreign currencies are actually to come. That is at the point in which we can actually do vocational training more on our side of the house. Government has an incentive to do this because they want voters and it's they want to appeal to voters to begin with. The second thing they see is that it doesn't trickle down to the bottom of the people and the local individuals. Two responses here. Firstly, no, it does trickle down. It happens. I think our first argument already proves this. But secondly, I think this is uncomparative to begin with, because all of the foreign direct investment problems that they have identified symmetrically exist on either side of the house. It's unclear to me whether they were listening to Seiji's speech. And I think Seiji gives you 4-way mechanisms as to why this job loss is most important argument within the debate, especially when compared to their argument on the bluster things like cost of living, which is why I think this still is our path to victory. Finally, let's talk about the economic development. Our claim in this debate was really simple, that this economic failure will lead to massive job loss for people in the service sector and tourism sector. Numerically, the number of people decreasing from 40 million to 10 million, this means that given that the number of customers drastically falls, big companies have to lower the salaries of their workers and they have to lay off individuals who are working at the bottom of their corporate ladder. That is the bullet that they need to defend in this debate. The first thing they say is that other countries will develop and other industries will develop and diversify. Firstly, let's say again, USA is out of the debate, but secondly, they don't have methods to compete with other developed countries for things like industrialization hasn't still happened. But secondly, I think tourism is much more unique because I think historical monuments and things like that does not require you to have machines. The second thing they say is that this is short term and it's like really unpredictable to begin with. I have like two responses to begin with. Firstly, I want to point out that it is mostly true that people go in different seasons. For example, for two reasons. One, because I think there's different allures and attractions in different like seasons to begin with. But secondly, when it's like let's say Hawaii, for example, I think people would want to go to let's say winter, because if relatively less people go to winter, you can actually enjoy more and go to different places at the same time, which is why I think their claim is not standing. But even if it is short term and it is unpredictable, I think one thing that they have yet to prove in this debate is the comparative. Because yes, it might be unpredictable, but they never prove why their comparative industry is better, which is why I think just because saying that these individuals were harmed in the COVID-19 crisis is not going to be enough for them. The reason here is simple. The reason why I think this beats out their claim against cost of living is because I think cost of living in and of itself is not a harm, right? If we say that the things like salaries are going to rise as a result of it, I think they are able to actually cope against the cost of living, which is why I think the most vulnerable context of this debate, countries like Maldives, countries like Seychelles are going to win us the debate. For all those reasons, Team Japan takes this debate.
I am going to talk about three clashes, but I want to note two things that is going to entirely win us this debate from the very beginning. Firstly, all of the harms proposition brings to you are to some extent true. They do exist. Over-tourism is in some way harmful. But all of those harms can be heavily mitigated, if not entirely eliminated, through regulation. And we proved to both the incentive and capacity to do so from second speaker to no engagement after two speeches from their bench. I think it is far too late from reply. The second reason why we take this debate at the very top, even before the clashes, is because liberalization was entirely unengaged to. I said this in my speech, no engagement from their bench. I think Naki weighs this beautifully. Liberalization, even if it is an extreme impact, even if this impacts only 1-2 countries, I think that this is an impact worth caring about. These people ought to be cared for. Three clashes then. Firstly, I want to talk about the economy, but I want to note two things about their outlandish claims at the beginning. The two claims I want to note is firstly, that the money leaks out through MNCs. To some extent, this is true. We have to accept that. The problem with this is twofold. One, that we've given you mechanization to prove to you that trickle-down in some way does exist. And secondly, that this is an uncomparative claim, that any other MNC that comes into the country in their world, in any other industry, is still going to lead to the leaking out of the economy. Let's also talk about their claim on the over-reliance. Yes, we are in some extent over-reliant, but this is again an intensely uncomparative claim when their comparative is to shift the economy into another industry and to just be as over-reliant on that. And yes, tourism industry was massively harmed by COVID, but so was every other industry. With that said then, I want to talk about two far more important subclasses. First, on jobs. Are there jobs in our world? They say two reasons why this is untrue. From our first speaker, we flip all of this. We tell you that things like service industries, training, vocational training, state support can only exist in our world where the tourist industry is in some way successful. Therefore, there are jobs in our world. On the comparative then, are jobs going to exist in proposition? We say no, and the response to just do vocational training isn't a valid alternative when one, the poorest individuals who are only employed in our world are absolutely messed up because they can't access vocational training in their world. And secondly, it's unclear what money they're doing this vocational training with when Seychelles is incredibly poor. This means that this argumentation, which I weighed for 4 mechanisms from my speech, alone can win us this debate. This is more important than any other claim. Let's also talk about this claim on displacement. We outframed and outweighed this argumentation from second. I don't think it stands and their whip didn't bother extending. Finally, and thirdly, on seasonality, we proved to you that this is not only untrue, but also comparatively better in our world, but it's also unclear why this is so especially bad. Like ski resorts earn all of their money in the winter and have enough money there to carry them through the next year. This means that seasonality is not an inherent harm. They have to prove to you it's harmful. Let's talk about culture in the second clash then. We gave you 3 unresponded mechanisms from second speaker. 1, we can just subsidize culture. We can do things like allow communal ownership of it. Secondly, that tourist sites and cultural sites are vastly different. And thirdly, that people do enforce these on them by themselves, even if state regulation were to somehow fail. I think that culture is obviously our side. Finally, let's talk about the environment. The important framing of this environment argument is that this is an intensely unimportant argument in the context of this debate because tourism and its CO2 emission pales in comparison to a lot of other industries like multinational corporations and their industrialization, cruise ships, cars, wars, all of those emit more, and insofar as they're not even vouching for the entire abolishment of tourism, but just simply the limitation of tourism, I don't think that this is a high delta clash. I don't think, therefore, that proposition was adequate in proving to you that they can now magically solve the entire problem with sea levels that Maldives has. This environment clash is low delta. What is a delta is three important things. One, for conservative nations where vulnerable individuals are harmed, we liberalize them in one way or another. Two, for jobs, we don't put people out of business, we allow for employment to continue. And thirdly, for the nation's economy, tourism is a necessity. We may not want it to be so, but it is. For all these reasons, proud to stand on the opposition bench. Thank you.
The exact time you can trace that an opposition loses a debate is the point at which they make an argument that is so profoundly unstrategic that they then downbench, disregard the engagement we give to you on it. Because we told you why liberalization is something that isn't going to function. We told you why countries use tourism as a front to pretend as if they're liberalizing and then do things like use slavery, the Kafkala system, to build up the systems that enable that tourism in the first place. And we also told you why these countries are uniquely not dependent or leaning on the public perceptions of individuals in the West to survive. So if Saudi Arabia is perceived to be a police state, generally, we don't think the opinions of Western tourists are things that largely shifted in that regard, but we think secondly that those opinions were easily manipulated. That's engagement we gave you, that's engagement that's unresponded to. And so their alternative path to victory is out of this debate quickly off the top of the speech. Three things then. Firstly, on context, secondly, on the economy, and lastly, on the preservation of culture. Contextually speaking, we already told you why developed nations are important in this debate. They aren't dependent on tourism, and so the limitation when it comes to the populaces generally is something that is marginal. And note then that the focus of the people in the nation is something that is uniquely overshadowed by headline economic figures in the state. So the mayor of Paris, for instance, accepts broadly that things like the Olympics are going to happen while not listening to the outcries of the populations that have to deal with those Western tourists on a day-to-day basis. But also, their point on this being empirically untrue just disregards the way the world functions. We told you why the tourists who have the money are more likely to flood into countries they're more capable or comfortable in, but we also told you why this is something that's uniquely impacted within these states. And so all of our analysis on the majority context in this round is something that still stands. But secondly, note their assumption that tourism just ceases to exist. Demand still exists. That demand side is still pretty high on our side, and we're just regulating the influx of tourists within a nation. We have yet to prove why this is so disastrous when it comes to the individuals themselves. So at this point then, understand that the majority context is one on our side, and the individual clashes will take out the externalities. On the first conversation on the economy and the harming of people in those nations, we told you two things. The first thing is that you compete with tourists for resources. And note that this is something that's supported by every bit of analysis they give you on tourist spending power. These people are inherently short-termers. They're able to spend your monthly wage in a week, and that's what they come there to do. What is their response? The extent of their response is just tourists have different places that they're competing with individuals with. So it's not a direct competition, but largely the harms occur in different places. We gave you two responses. Firstly, on centrality. That is, you as a tourist want to be in the center of a city where the economic activity is, where it's bustling, where the nightlife is accessible. The same center that individuals who have jobs want to be accessing as well. That creates direct competition that can't be regulated out. But secondly, note the impact of the increasing cost of land on our side, because that doesn't just isolate one area, it isolates the majority of instances where that land is going to increase in cost. When Airbnb buys out a massive amount of properties, there's less properties for you to have your supermarket on, increasing your cost and ability to provide for locals. But secondly, they told you the creation of jobs is something that occurs. But we told you that you uniquely lock out alternative economies from developing. You lack development of other economies because of the lack of incentive states have. They don't have the necessity to generate alternative economies, and they're going to ignore those economies as a result. Thailand ignores its nascent manufacturing center because of the tourist income it generates. And as a result then, we also told you that tourism is uniquely unstable because it's the first thing to go when a shock like COVID-19 happens. So sure, things are able to decrease when it comes to bad economic circumstances, responses, but tourism is uniquely unstable in that regard. Two deadlock breakers. One, interest develops or decreases in the long term. So like Spanish islands, for instance, had less attention on them, and that's something that means the money is less long-termist. But secondly, the investment in rebuilding the homes you create, like rebuilding shores from those like constructions, is something that's bad. So that money doesn't even get funneled down. Secondly, on cultural preservation, we told you there are regulations that are panacea, and you can't regulate tourist behavior as effectively. Note then that we win on this debate for the people who live in these countries that we've been proud to propose.